December 17th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning, Hansfeld, Belgium. The engine of the Tiger tank coughed, sputtered, and then died. SS Obashto Banura Yahim Piper banged his fist against the turret hatch. The sound echoed in the early morning darkness. His driver, Yunsha Weber, tried to restart the 700 horsepower Maybach engine. Nothing happened. The fuel gauge showed empty. Herr Oberanora Weber called from his compartment. His voice was tight with panic as he announced that the reserve tank was also dry. Piper climbed down from his command tank, his boots crunching on the frozen Belgian ground. Around him sat the most powerful armored spearhead the Wehrmacht had assembled for Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes offensive. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and nearly 5,000 of Germany's elite Waffen-SS soldiers were all immobilized by empty fuel tanks. Through the morning mist, Piper saw the abandoned American position ahead. Hansfeld was a crucial supply depot for the United States 99th Infantry Division. The Americans had fled so quickly that fires still burned in oil drums and coffee remained hot in metal cups. There, like a gift from the god of war, stood rows upon rows of jerry cans, thousands of them, the distinctive olive-drab containers filled with American fuel. Piper approached slowly, almost reverently. His adjutant, Hauptadamführer Hans Gruller, pried open one can and sniffed the high-octane gasoline as his men began the frantic task of refueling their vehicles. Piper walked through the stockpile, counting. The numbers were staggering. 50,000 gallons, enough to fuel his entire group for the push to the Meuse River. It had the potential to change the course of the offensive. The Americans had left behind more fuel in this single depot than most German divisions had received in the past 6 months. But as Piper stood among this bounty watching his men pour American fuel into German tanks, a heavy realization washed over him like the morning fog. If the Americans could afford to abandon such quantities, if they could leave behind what Germany would protect with entire divisions, then this war was already over. Germany had not only miscalculated, Germany had completely misunderstood its enemy. 6 months before Piper's discovery at Hansfeld, in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War, production had given the Führer a report that should have halted all offensive actions right away. Germany's synthetic fuel production, crucial to the Wehrmacht, had been steadily ruined by Allied bombing. The Leuna works that produced 175,000 tons of fuel in April had dropped to just 5,000 tons by September. The hydrogenation plants at Pitz, Bleihammer, and Brooks were running at less than 10% of their capacity. The statistics painted a picture of inevitable defeat. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, with its synthetic production and the resources from captured Romanian fields, managed only 33 million barrels, which was less than 2% of American output. The Third Reich was trying to conduct mechanized warfare using horse-drawn logistics, while America was flooding its armies with an abundance of petroleum. Major Friedrich Simon of the Wehrmacht's Logistics Command calculated that the Ardennes offensive would need 4.5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. Adolf Hitler allocated 5 million gallons, but only half of that made it to the front due to transportation issues. The German High Command was risking the entire offensive on seizing enemy supplies, a tactic that showed weakness instead of strength. Meanwhile, the Americans had set up a petroleum pipeline system across France dubbed PLU, Pipeline Under the Ocean, along with the Red Bull Express, a large truck convoy system delivering 12,500 tons of supplies daily to the battlefront. By December 1944, American forces in Europe were using 1.2 million gallons of fuel each day, while receiving 1.4 million gallons. They were building reserves even as they battled on. Joachim Piper was no fool. At just 29 years old, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS. He held the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, and was a veteran of the Eastern Front, where he learned just how valuable fuel was in modern warfare. His unit had been designated as the Schwerpunkt, the key point of the entire Ardennes offensive. On December 14th, 2 days before the offensive began, Piper attended the final briefing in Tondorf. General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, was straightforward. He said they would have enough fuel to reach the Meuse River if they captured American supplies. The fuel allocation for Camp Grupper Piper was 31,000 gallons, enough for 50 miles of combat operations. However, the distance to the Meuse was 65 miles. The plan was flawed from the start. As his unit got ready to move on December 16th, Colonel Piper gave clear instructions. Tanks would travel in single file to save fuel. Engines were to be turned off during any stops longer than 5 minutes. Capturing American fuel supplies was their top priority, more important than tactical goals. The difference between their operations and those of the Americans was striking. That same morning, Captain James Rose of the United States 743rd Tank Battalion, stationed just 20 miles from City Pau, Piper's starting point, noted in his unit diary that they received a fuel resupply of 8,000 gallons. This was their third delivery that week, and their storage tanks were already full. The date was December 16, 1944, at 5:30 a.m. The German artillery barrage that marked the launch of Operation Watch on the Rhine used more ammunition in just 2 hours than the German military had allocated for entire operations earlier in the war. But even this impressive show of force masked severe shortages. Piper's unit began to move at 7 a.m., already behind schedule. The roads that looked like highways on German maps turned out to be narrow country lanes, many of which were unpaved. Within hours, traffic jams formed as vehicles intended for the Russian steppes struggled through the Ardennes forest. At Lanzarote, Piper's first target, they faced unexpected resistance from a single American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. 18 men managed to hold up the powerful German armored column for nearly 10 hours. During this delay, Piper's vehicles sat idle, wasting valuable fuel. When they finally broke through and reached Hansfeld at dawn on December 17th, Piper's column had covered only 20 miles and consumed 40% of their fuel. At this pace, they would run out before reaching the halfway point to their objective. The American supply depot at Hansfeld was not even a primary facility. It was a forward supply point for the 99th Infantry Division, categorized by the United States Army as a Class 3B depot, a temporary fuel station. Yet what Piper discovered there was more than the monthly fuel allocation for an entire German panzer division. Fuel officer Hans Gruller later reported, "We found pyramids of jerry cans, each carrying 5 gallons of gasoline. They were stacked 3 meters high, retching for about 200 meters. The Americans had not even tried to destroy them. The captured fuel was high-octane aviation gasoline blended with motor fuel of 80 octane or higher. German vehicles, especially the sensitive ones, Maybach engines in the Tiger tanks were designed to run on 74 octane fuel. The gasoline from America was actually too high in quality, leading to engine issues in several German vehicles. As Piper's men refueled, they made more important discoveries. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann found shipping manifests in the depot office. He could read English, having worked in his father's import business before the war. The documents showed that this fuel had traveled from Texas to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, across the Channel to Normandy, and then trucked 400 meters to Hansfeld. The total journey of over 6,000 miles had taken less than 6 weeks. I showed the papers to Führer Piper, Hoffmann recalled in a 1976 interview. Piper read the documents twice, then crumpled them. He didn't say anything, but his face turned pale. We both understood the implications. Private Ernst Kara discovered a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15th, which were just 2 days old. The headline announced the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, capable of delivering 300,000 gallons each day. This single pipeline could provide more fuel daily than Camp Grupper would need throughout the entire offensive. To grasp the shock of Piper's discovery, one must understand Germany's fuel situation by late 1944. Since May, Allied bombing had slashed synthetic fuel production by 90%. The Luftwaffe was grounding aircraft due to a lack of aviation fuel. Pilot training had been cut drastically from 250 flight hours down to 60 hours. The German Navy's surface fleet had essentially stopped operations. Submarines were fitted with snorkels to save diesel fuel by using batteries for longer. On the home front, German civilians had not seen private car traffic since 1942. Gasoline was so valuable that the Gestapo investigated black market theft of even small amounts. Farmers were going back to using horse-drawn plows. Meanwhile, the United States was producing 67% of the world's oil. The East Texas oil field alone produced more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined. American refineries were working at maximum capacity. Standard Oil was even testing new petroleum byproducts due to an excess of crude oil. With the 50,000 gallons captured at Hunsfeld, Piper's columns advanced quickly. They reached Billingen by noon on December 17th, seizing additional supplies, rations, ammunition, and crucial maps showing more American fuel depots in the area. However, the maps uncovered a troubling reality. The Americans had fuel. Stockpiles were found everywhere. Every major intersection had a depot. The United States First Army alone had 3.5 million gallons in reserve. Piper continued on to Ligville, where his forces committed the Malmedy massacre, killing 84 American prisoners. This war crime was also linked to fuel desperation. Piper later insisted he could not spare gasoline to transport the prisoners. By the evening of December 17th, Piper's spearhead reached Stavalo, which was the site of a major American fuel depot containing over 2 million gallons. This was enough fuel to ensure they could reach the Meuse River, but as the first German vehicles approached, American engineers were already at work. Captain John Brewster from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had been warned of the German advance. His orders were clear: deny fuel to the enemy at all costs. The Stavalo depot held 2,099,000 gallons of gasoline stacked in jerry cans across 15 acres. At 4:30 in the afternoon on December 17th, as Piper's advanced guard neared, Captain Brewster issued the order. Engineers set gasoline trails between the stacks. White phosphorus grenades were distributed. Technical Sergeant Paul Solus threw the first grenade. The explosion was immediate and massive, he remembered. A wall of fire shot up about 100 feet. In just minutes, the entire depot turned into an inferno. Piper's lead tanks arrived to find a column of black smoke reaching 1,000 feet into the sky. The fire burned for 3 days, consuming enough fuel to power Piper's entire division to Antwerp and back. Unterführer Wehr described the scene. The German commander stood on his tank turret watching the flames. He was silent for nearly 5 minutes. Then he climbed down and remarked that they could afford to burn 2 million gallons just to deny it to them. He questioned what they were doing there. Across the Ardennes, American engineers were destroying fuel dumps instead of risking capture. At Wapon, 1.1 million gallons were burned. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons were destroyed. Overall, American forces deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons during the first week, which was more than Germany had allocated for the entire operation. The ability to dispose of millions of gallons so easily stemmed from a supply system that was beyond German understanding. The Red Ball Express delivered 412,000 tons of supplies using 6,000 trucks operating around the clock. Each truck consumed 40 gallons of fuel daily. The entire operation burned more fuel than German Army Group B received in a month. By December 1944, the motor transport service utilized 230 truck companies that operated on color-coded routes. This system delivered 20,000 tons of supplies each day, which included 3,000 tons of fuel. On December 18th, Colonel James Snyder, the chief logistics officer for the First Army, noted that fuel receipts the previous day totaled 1,847,000 gallons, while 1,623,000 gallons were issued. This resulted in a net gain of 224,000 gallons to reserves. The pipeline system was even more remarkable. Operation Pluto had installed pipes across the English Channel, pumping 1 million gallons daily from Britain. A network of pipelines extended inland. The Cherbourg to Paris line provided 800,000 gallons daily, while the Seine line delivered 650,000 gallons. By December 1944, Allied forces in northwest Europe consumed 700,000 gallons per day, while receiving 8,200,000 gallons. They were building reserves during their offensive operations. As Piper advanced deeper into Belgium on December 18th, the hopelessness of the German position became apparent. At Char, they captured another depot. They used 5,000 gallons in just 3 hours of combat. Tiger tanks used 2.5 gallons per mile during battle, while Panthers consumed 1.5 gallons per mile. In the challenging Ardennes terrain, fuel consumption increased by 40%. Otto Dingler, the maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, in the 1st, 1931, noted that by noon on December 18th, they had used 67,000 gallons since the offensive began, while capturing only about 55,000 gallons. They were running at a deficit, the Anbatusion by have national longs in the deficit. Americans who monitored German radio traffic through ultra-intercepts were aware of Piper's fuel situation. General Courtney Hodges ordered all units to be alerted, stating that the enemy was critically short on fuel. He instructed them to destroy any gasoline stocks at risk of being captured. On that same day, American C-47 aircraft flew 316 sorties to deliver supplies to Bastogne, including 160,000 gallons of fuel. The Americans were supplying more fuel to a surrounded garrison than Piper's entire force had. By December 19th, as Piper's forces engaged defenders at Stoumont, the fuel crisis had reached a critical point. Tanks were being abandoned due to empty fuel tanks rather than battle damage. Piper consolidated his remaining fuel, which amounted to about 8,000 gallons. This was only enough for one engagement or retreat, but not both. Meanwhile, Allied planners were gearing up for operations in January. Brigadier General Maurice Gilland requested 245 million gallons for the upcoming month. The request was approved without any discussion. The contrast went beyond just numbers. American vehicles were standardized for efficiency. Sherman tanks consumed significantly less fuel. American trucks averaged 8 miles per gallon when fully loaded. In contrast, German tanks like the Tigers managed only 2.5 miles per gallon. The maintenance of American vehicles was straightforward. Parts were interchangeable, which simplified logistics. German forces dealt with a confusing mix of captured and domestically produced vehicles, each with its own requirements. For example, French tanks needed a different type of oil than German Panthers. Soviet trucks required different parts than German Opels. Each of these complications made supply issues even worse. On December 20th, Piper received troubling 700 NAND-by-night cups news via radio. An Allied airstrike had destroyed a fuel convoy, leaving them without a means to resupply. He was instructed to continue using whatever resources were left. Piper gathered his commanders for a meeting. Sturmbannführer Vera Pertke was direct in his assessment. He stated they had enough fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers, but the Meuse was 30 kilometers away. According to the testimony of H.T. Murat-Gruller, the Obersturmbannführer remarked, Gentlemen, we are fighting an enemy that uses more fuel to deny it to us than we have for this entire operation. What we captured at Hansfeld, which seemed like a miracle, was nothing compared to their abundance. We cannot win. This understanding began to spread among the ranks. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army, later wrote, "When I found out the Americans destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk us capturing it, I knew the offensive had failed before it had even begun." Colonel Friedrich von Donner, who was captured on December 23rd, told his interrogators, "Your soldiers waste chocolate. My men have not tasted chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons of fuel while we measure by the liter. How can we possibly fight against such abundance?" By December 21st, Piper found himself surrounded at Leyze, with his tanks rendered immobile. Surrounding him were forces from the 31st Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne, and the 3rd Armoured Division, which collectively had access to 340,000 gallons of fuel for just that day. In contrast, Piper had possibly only 1,000 gallons left. Private First Class Richard McKinney wrote home, saying, "We have the Germans surrounded and they have run out of gas. Our captain jokes that we use more fuel to heat our coffee than they have for their tanks." The American response showcased a peak of industrial warfare. Patton's Third Army required 350,000 gallons just to reposition north, a feat considered impossible by German standards but accomplished in just 3 days. December 23rd brought clear skies. Allied aircraft flew 2,000 sorties, each consuming fuel at rates that would have grounded the Luftwaffe for weeks. P-47 aircraft consumed 300 gallons per hour, while B-26 bombers burned 200 gallons each hour. The air operations of just 1 day used more fuel than Germany's entire offensive allocation. On the night of December 23rd to 24th, Piper left his vehicles behind and fled on foot. Out of the 119 tanks and assault guns that participated in the offensive, only 39 remained operational but could not move. These were destroyed using the remaining ammunition. Oberreiter Heinz Goals described the scene. He said they drained the last fuel from all vehicles, totaling around 200 gallons. The commanding officer personally destroyed his command tank. Millions of Reichmarks in equipment were lost due to empty fuel tanks. Of the 5,000 men who started with Piper's group, about 770 made it back. They had advanced 60 miles, captured several depots, and uncovered the reality of Allied logistics. Word of Piper's findings spread quickly through German command. On December 26th, Field Marshal Walter Model received reports about captured American supplies. His chief of staff noted Model's reaction. The Field Marshal read the quantities twice: 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, 2 million burned at Stavello, and 8 million destroyed rather than captured. He remarked, "We are not fighting the same war." By December 28th, Adolf Hitler was informed but refused to accept the truth. Speer wrote that Hitler insisted the figures were propaganda. When shown photos of the fires at Stavello, he dismissed them, claiming they were special effects. However, lower ranks understood the reality. Greer Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife, stating that Americans destroy more fuel every day than Germany receives in a month. He added that they drive tanks the way we march. This war is lost. The fuel crisis was just a sign of a larger problem. By 1944, the United States produced 50% of world manufacturing. This included a new aircraft every 5 minutes, a ship every day, and a tank every 7 minutes. The statistics on petroleum production was staggering. The United States produced 1.8 billion barrels. The Soviet Union produced 110 million barrels. Germany, including synthetic, produced 33 million barrels, and Japan produced 2.6 million barrels. Together, the Axis powers produced less than 2% of the petroleum output of the United States. Every major German offensive after 1942 had been hampered by fuel shortages, while every American offensive enjoyed ample support that German planners could not comprehend. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen recorded an enlightening incident on December 27th. A logistics officer reported that weather had cut fuel deliveries down to just 500,000 gallons daily. There was initial concern until someone pointed out that this amount exceeded Germany's entire offensive allocation. German prisoners of war from the Ardennes were more shocked by American waste than by American firepower. Witnessing American troops discard half-eaten rations or use gasoline to heat things shattered their morale even more than artillery fire. Ustgau Reichum shared this with interrogators. "We knew your production numbers in a vague way, but witnessing soldiers waste than we had made it all too real. Every German who witnessed your casual abundance realized the war was doomed." This understanding spread through letters, despite attempts at censorship. Feldwebel Ernst Müller wrote about observing Americans washing clothes in gasoline, feeding chocolate to dogs, and using artillery as Christmas celebrations. He noted that we could not fight against such vastness. This insight dismantled the narrative of German racial superiority. How could the decadent Americans possess so much while the master race struggled for basic necessities? During the Nuremberg trials, German leaders repeatedly mentioned logistics, especially fuel, as a crucial factor. Field Marshal Kittel testified that from 1940 to 1941, we had operational superiority. However, by 1944, we could not move our forces due to a lack of fuel, while Americans moved their armies as if they were chess pieces. Piper's attempt during the Malmedy massacre gave significant testimony. Every decision made after December 17th was affected by the fuel shortage. We could not maneuver, pursue, or retreat effectively. Meanwhile, Americans moved freely while we counted liters. General Heinz Guderian remarked that when Piper captured 50,000 gallons, it meant everything to him, but nothing to Americans. At that moment, the war was over. This story resonates deeply because it marks the end of industrial warfare. Wars were determined by production numbers, not the bravery of warriors. The romantic idea of combat faded in the Ardennes among empty fuel tanks. Dr. Richard Overy calculated that by 1944, the production ratios of the Allies to Axis exceeded 5-to-1 in major categories. In terms of petroleum, it approached 50 to 1. These advantages could not be overcome by superior training or tactics. The United States has produced 324,750 aircraft during the war, while Germany constructed only 119,970. The United States built 88,410 tanks, compared to Germany's 46,857. Most significantly, the United States refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944 alone, while Germany managed just 33 million barrels. On December 24, 1944, as Piper's men moved through American lines on foot, abandoning 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 other vehicles, the scale of the situation became clear. They had captured 50,000 gallons, which seemed miraculous, but was meaningless to an enemy capable of burning millions. Unterführer reflected in 1975 about that day in Hansfeld. Initially, finding American fuel felt like winning the lottery, but by evening, after hearing about Stavelot burning, we understood that we had already lost. The Americans had so much fuel that they could destroy what we would die to possess. The 50,000 gallons of fuel were consumed by a single American armored division in just 2 days. It was less than what the Red Ball Express used up in 3 hours. This amount was a rounding error in the daily needs of the Allied forces. Major General J. Lawton Collins noted that the German attempts to seize fuel showed their mistake. They thought we valued fuel as they did, as something irreplaceable. They could not grasp that we had so much fuel that we could afford to waste millions instead of risking any tactical disadvantage. Operation Watch on the Rhine collapsed due to the unforgiving math of industrial warfare. The offensive alone consumed around 2.8 million gallons, which was 40% of the PARP-E overall fuel allocation, all of it taken from captured supplies. Meanwhile, Americans used 267 million gallons in that same time frame, nearly 100 times more. The Wehrmacht lost 100,000 soldiers, 800 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. Yet the most devastating loss was the shattering of illusions. Every German soldier who saw the abundance of American resources understood that Germany was not just engaged in a war, it was paving its own path to defeat. Jim Piper was imprisoned until 1956 for war crimes. He was killed in his home in France on July 14, 1976, by unknown assailants. However, in 1967, he told historian Henry Lehman that discovering the fuel depot was a disaster. He believed that if they had run out of fuel earlier, they might have been able to retreat with dignity. Instead, they learned that Americans had an ocean of resources while they only had drops. They faced the reality of their situation. This lesson goes beyond World War II. In industrial warfare, logistics take precedence over tactics. Production overshadows bravery. Abundance defeats commitment. By 1944, the German soldier was often better trained and more seasoned, but it made little difference. Americans benefited from an industrial capability that could waste more than Germany could ever produce. This truth was evident in every artillery piece at Hansfeld, every gallon of fuel used at Stavelot, and every pipeline running through France. Wars between industrial nations are decided by factories and refineries, not by brilliant commanders. Colonel Trevor Dupee calculated that in December 1944, each American soldier was supported by 67 units of supplies every day. In contrast, each German soldier received just 3. Americans might complain about waste, but Germans would see American waste as unimaginable abundance. In 1984, 40 years after the battle, veterans gathered at Lazy. The museum showcased Piper's Tiger tank, still in the spot where it ran out of fuel on December 23, 1944. Former soldier Karl Wortmann stood beside the tank with former Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson from the 30th Infantry Division. "We often wondered why you stopped," Anderson said. "We thought it was a tactical move." Wortmann let out a bitter laugh. "We halted because our tanks ran dry. You wasted millions to keep it from us. How could we compete with that?" Anderson fell silent for a moment before replying, "We never realized you were that low on fuel. We had so much ourselves that we never considered it." That conversation reflected the reality of December 1944. One side measured fuel by the gallon, while the other wasted millions. One fought for each jerry can, while the other burned vast amounts. The result was inevitable. German records tell a grim story. In Army Group B's war diary for December 1944, the offensive began on December 16th, with only 70% of the minimum fuel needed. On December 17th, Piper captured 50,000 gallons. By December 18th, multiple depots were destroyed, leading to a loss of over 5 million gallons. On December 19th, the fuel situation became critical, leaving units unable to move. By December 24th, Piper abandoned vehicles due to fuel exhaustion. Meanwhile, the First Army reported on December 16th that they had reserves of 3.7 million gallons. On December 17th, 2.2 million gallons were destroyed. But by December 18th, they received 1.8 million gallons. By December 24th, their reserves climbed to 4.1 million gallons. The Americans treated millions with indifference, while the Germans focused on individual cans. Beyond just quantity, American fuel stood for technological superiority. American refineries refined catalytic cracking, yielding higher octanes more efficiently than German hydrogenation methods. American 100-octane aviation fuel offered aircraft performance benefits compared to German planes that used 87-octane synthetic fuel. Americans developed additives that Germany could not match, such as tetrathalide, ethylene, and diaromide detergents. German engines, designed for lower quality fuel, often struggled when using captured American gasoline. The fuel shortage affected every soldier's experience. Gerrit Hams Muller recorded on December 20th that they marched 30 kilometers. There was no fuel for trucks, so they passed abandoned American vehicles that had their engines running for warmth. They left their engines on. We marched through the snow. Medical services were in disarray. Ambulances could not transport the wounded. Hospitals could not operate generators. Men died while waiting for transports that would never arrive. Oberarch Dr. Dashner C. Wilhelm Kirsting testified, "We had excellent surgeons and supplies captured from the Americans, but no fuel for our ambulances. Men died who could have been saved with just a 10-kilometer transport." These findings shattered the German propaganda that depicted American weakness. Soldiers had been told that Americans were soft and incapable. Then they discovered that Americans could destroy more than Germany had. Goebbels' diary for December 28th noted these realizations. Reports show significant morale issues among German soldiers. They express concerns about American superiority, which undermines our narrative. Stories spread more quickly than censorship can contain. The idea of German superiority couldn't withstand the reality of American logistics. The failure in the Ardennes left Germany with no choice but to defend desperately. General Jodl testified at the Nuremberg trials, stating that after the Ardennes, they knew the war was lost. They had played their last card and realized that the enemy held all the advantages. Understanding Germany's desperation, the Allies focused on crippling fuel production. By February 1945, German fuel production came to a halt. The Luftwaffe was grounded, and training was cancelled. The Wehrmacht became static and was gradually destroyed by agile enemies. The spring of 1945 brought bizarre scenes. German units surrendered due to immobility, not defeat. Entire panzer divisions sat helplessly as Allied forces moved past them. General Major Fritz Bohlin recounted having 42 operational tanks with experienced crews and ammunition. However, they had only 300 liters of fuel, far too little to reach the next town. They chose to destroy their tanks and walk into captivity. Meanwhile, the American advance was only limited by traffic jams caused by an overwhelming number of vehicles. The Third Army alone had 15,000 vehicles. Kampfgruppe Piper's fuel crisis illustrates how industrial capacity determined the outcome of World War II. When Piper stood among captured jerry cans that December morning, he recognized an undeniable truth. The Allies fought against an enemy that wasted more than they needed. The figures reveal everything. German offensive allocation was 5 million gallons, while Americans destroyed 8 million gallons of fuel. The Americans consumed 7.5 million gallons daily. Piper's capture at Hansfeld involved 50,000 gallons, which accounted for just 0.6% of the American daily supply. The Battle of the Bulge resulted in 19 US and American deaths and perhaps 100,000 German casualties. It depleted the Wehrmacht's last reserves, but its lasting effect was to inform German ranks about America's enormous abundance. Piper's realization extended beyond fuel. It highlighted the nature of industrial warfare. Victory depended on who could produce the most petroleum, steel, and aluminum. Germany never stood a chance. In a final twist, American forces catalogued abandoned German equipment in Ules and found 39 perfect tanks left behind simply due to a lack of fuel. Major Robert Harrison's salvage report stated that fuel was required for only 8,000 gallons, with minimal classification sourced from local reserves, and it would take just 4 hours. What was impossible for the Germans' 8,000 gallons to save their best tanks went unnoticed by American forces. A small request using local reserves surpassed Grouper Piper's peak strength. This was Piper's finding at Hansfeld. It was clear that not only did America have more fuel, but their abundance was on a scale that made German shortages insignificant. The war ended when American industrial capability was fully activated. Hansfeld highlighted a truth that had been evident since 1942. Germany was engaged in an impossible battle, counting defeat in gallons. In contrast, America counted victory in oceans. The Tiger tank is now displayed at Legless's museum, its fuel gauge on empty. It stands as a testament to the clash between tactical skill and logistical reality, which ultimately resulted in failure. Visitors often wonder why such powerful tanks were left behind. The answer is simple. There was no fuel.